Thank you, Nikos, very much for the presentation. Also, Victor. What I appreciate most, well, on a larger scale, is that you also set up a nice framework for the new critical environments group that you're setting up in the urban design section. And what I find fascinating is how you move through scales, starting from the cow, its entanglement with new technologies, how that is influencing now the building of the farmhouses, and how that is connected through a global network of things. On another side, so this is more like a scalar movement. On another side is the cultural component, which I find fascinating. How, for example, the type or the typifying of the cows, how that has a sort of history also in humans, but also like the desire to make types out of buildings, out of animals, out of flowers, and how that also becomes sort of industrialized and became a theme during the 18th and 19th century, and now it has moved in these new modes of even, one could say, automating types. And on the other hand, we have these ideas of culture or models. So both of these are interpretations, right? They are speculations which kind of gain agency and gain power. And on the other hand, we have the models, such as you presented, Nikos, which also has gained, or at least it explains how the global chain of things works. I would like to open up the discussion. This was more like my fascination and what I really look forward from the critical environments. I would like to ask you briefly on to share at least your reflection on some methods, because on this interrelations between scale, cultures, global supply chains, there is a vast areas of knowledge to be covered. And probably architects have as a generalist, well, could help in understanding them or making some links, and even help in situating them, specializing them. So I would be very much interested to know about how you see this methods of studying these interconnected things, well, or even transforming them and teaching them as methods for education and so on. But I would also like to open up the floor for if there are any questions.
I have a question or reflection that is related to. Thank you very much for the talks. There were two things that really struck me, and they are somehow interrelated. In Victor's presentation, there was this image when the true type cow was removed from the landscape, and then there was this kind of hello landscape remained. But then you also mentioned the true type landscape, which I think is a quite metaphorical and interesting term. And then what struck me in Nico's presentation is this layering of different landscapes. Many of the terms that you used were kind of new to me, or I found them quite metaphorical again, like the operational landscape, the theoretical landscape, the profit landscape. And I was wondering about what it has to do with embodiment and disembodiment and layering. And I think it's also quite interesting that Nico's research is grounded in the US, because the US has quite a lot of quite a history in creating a landscape that is detached from the observer, that you perceive through some technological means, be it a car, a train, whatever you call. So I was thinking of, and it goes back to the previous presentations of this conflict of the countryside and the landscape, and like, what do you think of this conception and like this lack of density, or like the lack of flesh that we you see there? Like, how is this perception of the lack of density is interconnected? I think it was just to sum up, or like to give a hint, I think it was also interesting how in certain maps you change from expressing density from color to height, and like how we go from a horizontal growth to a vertical growth. I would be super happy to hear about these mappings and the landscape versus the countryside.
Yes. Wow, thank you. That's quite a few things to unpack here. I think maybe also to connect it back to what Gent said about the models and all these theoretical frameworks that we have. It's interesting to always question a bit this chicken and egg question, right? Why space like that? Because we have a certain way of interpreting it, so we make it according to our way of interpreting it, right? So it's always interesting to think when you are working at systems that have a scale that you cannot really comprehend through your immediate experience, right? An agricultural system, the agri-food systems, for example, of today, it's very different than this idea, oh, I have a little village and around it I have the farms and I source the food and the goats are hanging out there and I know somehow the weather patterns and all these things, right? So you really need to depend a lot on symbolic languages like data, representations of data and things like that, right? So the question is, the actors that are shaping these landscapes, right? And sometimes, as Victor said, it could have been architects. It's not. Like no one hired any architect to design this new whatever greenhouse, right? But let's say the actors are more like economic actors, right? Or the state, right? So let's say we have these two big categories of actors. So how does the state see space and landscape and the resource in the landscape, and how companies, economic agents, multinational corporations see space? I mean, for the state, it's always a bit complicated because it's just reflecting conflicts of interest, right? But for companies, and this is where I think we need to be blunt, space and landscape is an opportunity for profit, right? A company wants to make money. I mean, every company should say that up front, right? Instead of saying, oh, I want to save the world, I want to save the whatever, the environment, right? You want to make money, first of all, right? So it's a profit landscape. And you read it in a specific way, right? So you can extract profit out of it. The question is it an actual correct way of seeing it, even if you want to make profit? You know, do they read it in the right way? Or there are other ways of reading it and still making profit? So there is one question, which is, oh, if we agree with the fact that profit-driven corporations are shaping the metabolic system, and there is a second layer, which is maybe they have the wrong reading of the landscape, even if they want to make money, and they are creating a disaster even for themselves. And I think it's an interesting point here. The argument of the ecological surplus that I presented, where value comes from, there is a question at the end of this argument, which is basically this system of capitalist profit making has been making money out of the appropriation of the unpaid work of nature. At the same time, it has been exhausting nature to provide this unpaid work. So it's basically like sabotaging itself, right? So maybe the environmental crisis is embedded, obviously it is embedded within this profit-making system, but maybe even for these companies, it is not the way to do business. And this to me, it's an interesting logic. So according to, for example, to these authors, the end of capitalism is the end of the frontiers of nature. So the moment this exhaustion is going to be generalized and everything is commodified, no one is going to make any profits, right? That's it. There's not going to be any source of free value, right? It's an interesting question to me. Obviously, the value question and the profit question is a question of political economy, which is also where the state comes in. I mean, the state cannot be seeing space in the same way a company that wants to make money sees space, right? It needs to include other values. Are these values there? They don't seem to be there, in my opinion, for example. Maybe as a discipline, we have also an opportunity there. And not just an opportunity, maybe an obligation to add these values. But also through the layering, through all these things, this is also what I'm trying to say, that there are different ways of reading. These layers, this space, make it a bit more abstract. But yeah, I think it's a really important question. This chicken and egg question in relation to our representation of space, understanding of space, and how we act upon it, I think it's key here. And there are different ways, I think, to do it. We have a lot of opportunities to reinvent those.
Well, just briefly on the question of the split between countryside and landscape. I think that's a very important one because we can see how, indeed, there are different expectations of that territory. So for one part of society, it's about recovering the ecological function, making landscape work for us in ecological terms. For others, it's more about the cultural landscape, the image of how this landscape should look like. For the countryside, it's more indeed about the economic side of things, which is has lead to exhaustion of the land. And then we see how, with this example I show of the let's move everything indoors, which already is happening with the pigs and the chicken. The cows were the last frontier because, let's say, the idea of landscape in the Netherlands is so coupled to the cow, to having the cow on the fields, that they feel it's going to be very difficult to have society accepting having cows indoors. But we see how there's a point in which, like the profit-making enterprises, they see there's not much hope in investing in recovering the land. Let's just invest in capital and make an indoor environment for that landscape, and then just let society make the landscape work in a different way.
Yeah, I would just like to follow up because what you just now described, I would say it's not the global state. It's not a global state, so like it's not neutral situation because I mean, I was wondering how do you read aspect of the colonialism involved in this whole story, because when you say like the soybeans are exported, yeah, they are exported from Amazon, or palm oil from Indonesia, or timber from Congo forest. So I think like, and what you also described in terms of the circular organization of the cities is not how Cairo works. So I think there is a power play in this, and I was wondering how you actually read within, I think it relates to both presentations, but maybe more to yours, then, which I really love this way of sequence of map as something which is a learning point. So if we have a lot of them and if we accumulate a lot of data, then we can actually learn about some patterns and relate them to politics. But I think there is also the aspect of power play in them. And we have also indigenous farming and their own way of organizing cities, which is completely different to the Western model that's now implied as the overall model. So I would just like if you could comment a little bit on that.
No, but I didn't present it as a global model. This is why I presented this map that shows that this feedlot model, it's basically starting from the Western agricultural practices, and it's getting expanded across the world. I don't know if this made sense.
Like, do you think there is any sort of feedback from the other side? Like
Absolutely, yeah. So the whole idea.
So when they come to the power play, like the whole global south comes to the power play, like then, like like I was just kind of wondering, like where is the duality in the presentation? Like, so what's their response? Like, so how they are they only passive player? Like.
Yes, so the logic is the following. This feedlot landscape is a landscape that needs to be subsidized. It would be very expensive if it was not subsidized with cheap natures from somewhere else, right? The only reason you can keep having these very expensive landscapes is because you subsidize them, right? And you subsidize them mostly through ecological and equal exchange. And this ecological and equal exchange happens at different scales, right? And at different moments historically. In the 19th century, it was happening under the colonial paradigm. Now you have much more complicated post-colonial forms of exploitation. I wouldn't call it, global south, global north, a kind of a situation anymore. But for sure, there are areas that are interdependent to each other in unequal ways, right? But that was my let's say, my effort here to show that when we are looking at agricultural lands around the world, these are not operating in the same way. Some landscapes are more, geared towards subsistence economies of farming. Some are geared towards industrialized inputs for the commodity markets, right? But your question about Cairo, I'm not sure I got it very well. Obviously, certain cities have more things that are informally, let's say, circular, right? But in general, urbanization as a form of organization of population always needs to depend upon some sourcing of outside areas. So there is just this generic dynamic there. Obviously, it's different around the world and in different periods in time, but in general, you need to have some landscapes to support the concentrations of people in cities.
Yeah, of course. I was just thinking that they are not always deliberately planned, like, so they were
Yeah.
not always arranged as a mechanism top down, but they sometimes evolved through also spontaneous way of, I mean, the whole north of Colombia, these channels that were then made in the form of fish that were then destroyed when Spaniards came there. Like, they had completely other way of organization, urban organization. So I'm just thinking like that. I'm questioning how deliberately urbanization plan is, and I mean, I'm sure that is when we take the point of Cerda and like the Western planning, but I'm thinking that there is also some opposite of it, and when we talk about the global scale, I would also like to hear and to learn more about what's the reaction. Like, that was.
I agree with you completely, but maybe I don't know. I was misunderstood. I didn't say that this was a model according to which someone planned the relationship of cities with the countryside. I said it was a theoretical model. No one actually planned this relationship, and this is also one of the interesting questions for us. We have in urbanism, we have a lot of examples of planned cities. And even the whole, colonial exchange is full of these examples, right? Not only one way, from the Spanish examples going to South America, but also the other way around. But no one really designed these relationships of cities with the more than city environments. They were either indirectly somehow formed through, colonial relations, economic relations, geopolitical, geopower, questions, right? Or they were resolved a bit more informally in communities that were able or had the scales to be able to still do that, right? But from the moment you start integrating all these areas into an economic system, right, it's like saying, oh, you can still have some subsistence economy, but then also start exporting also a bit, because your economy needs to grow, which was the logic, of the World Bank, of all the post-war effort to integrate these markets, right? But if you start exporting some of it, then at some point you will start exporting more and more of it, and you will have less and less subsistence farming, for example, and you will start having more and more people, for example, being without opportunity to be supported of the land. Right? So I presented very quickly all these 4 or 5 points, and I presented them, I selected these points because it's interesting to also see them not just in the post-war period, but also in the 19th century colonial phase of globalization. They are, again, very similar, these points. It's an effort to integrate these markets into the economy, to create the infrastructures, to create the institutions of trade. So this is how I want to highlight a bit the more generic manners. Of course, we can dig into the different stories, to the different sites, have more situated examples. But my effort is to generalize a bit the more somehow bare bone dynamics of this relationship.
Thanks. I leave to others.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question that I think might link both of your presentations somehow together. You talked about automation, and I was thinking about automated landscapes within this operational landscape concept. So we saw like the cows that were no longer managed by humans, but humans could be behind a computer, which might not even have to be there at the same place where the cows are in the future. So I was wondering, what do you think this Van Thunen's model, for example, would change based on the automation and future automation, so that humans might not even need to commute to these farms? And yeah, if you could elaborate a bit on that, that was one thing. And the second, also nature and soil. Maybe we can grow also in under soilless conditions. So what that means then for the ecosystem exploitation and the nature values that you were talking about, that nature has to compensate. So these are maybe 2 questions, but yeah, if you could elaborate both of you on that, I think that would be an interesting aspect to combine.
Thanks. About the automation question, indeed, I think that the whole point of that technology is indeed to separate humans from the animals. So the management of the animals happens through screen, mediated through screens, the computer or an app, and that's apparently achievable. Let's say, like in principle, a farmer has not had contact with a cow in maybe 80% of the time in a year. However, there is the need to take care of their machines now. The machines fail, you have to calibrate them, you have to charge them, connect them, check them. So let's say the labor of the farmer goes more into the supporting technology than the animals themselves. And that's something that probably is the difference. So the farmer becomes more like a manager and tech person than someone who takes care of the animals.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking how much to open up the discussion because there is an interesting point. So this model that I presented, this theoretical model, which I said was actually based on transportation costs, and that's it, right? It's interesting because the starting point for this investigation of this person, von Thunen, he didn't care about land use. His question was, what's the fair wage to pay the farmers? What should be the fair way? How much should we pay them, right? Because think that it's like a post-feudalist condition in which you start having wage labor working on the land, and no one knows how much we should be compensating these wage laborers that are working on the land, right? And his effort was to define the wages based on the costs and the cost of transport and all these things, and the cost of the land and how much profit you can make and all these things, right? Obviously, neoclassical economics, profit was zero, right? It was balancing out, right? It was a perfect, curve. But it's an interesting question, right? So how much we should pay these people? I think the question is the following, and it's always related to globalization. So automation mostly happens in areas where labor is becoming very expensive, right? And labor is becoming very expensive also in relation to how much you can be transporting things, right? And it's interesting to think about it within the context of the very somehow xenophobic discussions that we're having in the Netherlands and in Europe, right? That the problem is, immigration and all these things, right? So if you want to somehow create a closed border system, like von Thunen's system, and you have probably a shortage of labor at some point, or you cannot outsource labor-intensive things in other countries that have cheap labor, because now you also want to control trade and have tariffs and all these things, right? There is only one thing you can do. You can start investing in automation, right? So I think you can only see these questions not as technological evolution questions, but mostly as geopolitical questions. Another good example is the whole antebellum period discussion in the US, that there is a whole explanation why, for example, the North industrialized and the South didn't industrialize. And one of the answers is because they had slave labor, which is free labor, basically. So why would they invest in machines and capital-intensive means of making agriculture if they had free work, right, of slave labors, right? So there's always discussion that they had a shortage of labor, they had to invest, they mechanized. If they didn't, they wouldn't. They would probably, do something that what we did, after the war, that basically some things that were very labor-intensive were outsourced, some that remained here were very automated, right? So I would only see these questions within their broader geopolitical economy and less as part of, the ecosystem of the farm and the technological and if the cows are happy and all these things. I'm pretty sure if we had like an influx of cheap immigrant labor that we could actually house somewhere, right, and there would not be these complaints about housing, we would not really have these big discussions about automation, technology, saving labor costs and all these things. But I think this is a much bigger discussion, right?
Maybe one final one.
Yeah, I am now I'm trying to also reflect on the question that was asked earlier in the first panel about the visibility and the invisibility of these landscapes. So I'm just wondering if you merge the automated landscapes to the production landscapes uh, instead of the countryside in the city. So if you invert the model, and also referring to Michael Sorkin's steady state for growing food efficient, making productive urban landscapes, and also from uh, the cattle population that you showed about India, where we have a lot of animals in the city. So, what, like, uh, how would these landscapes change if all of this was happening in the city instead of the countryside?
Can I just make an observation in terms of land use? I think it's an interesting question, I think, especially for urbanists, because we really care about understanding density, right? And some things you might initially interpret as being conflicting with each other, meaning, oh, you cannot have density of people and density of whatever animals or density of plants. And then someone says, oh, but there is this vertical farming, right? Unfortunately, if you look at the breakdown of the global land use of agriculture, all these things that are the good candidates for concentrating in cities, they don't really take up that much land. So vegetable production, for example, is completely insignificant in terms of global land use of agriculture. So even if you manage to create all these tomato towers and vegetable towers, or have gardens in your in your yard to cultivate vegetables and fruits, this is not really going to make a big impact, actually. Actually, almost 30% of global agriculture is not even for food or feed. It's for inputs for the industry, like tobacco, cotton, rubbers, things like that. So food is only one part of it. So even if we actually manage to concentrate even all the food production, which imagine how much more conflict over land use is going to create. Right now, we cannot even resolve the housing question that we don't have these things in the cities. Imagine introducing more and more uses in the cities. Oh, animals or energy production, right? Imagine all the conflict that we're going to have. Who is going to resolve it? The market is going to resolve it? How? By pricing what? Like the tower of the vegetables different than the tower with the offices? I mean, how is this going to happen? Is it going to be a centralized planning scheme of distributing densities of humans and more than humans in the city? I think it's a very complicated question, and it's not going to solve actually very much of the environmental issues that we have right now with globalized industrial agriculture.
Yeah, I think that what we said about the question of the growing vegetables, is the caloric energy you get out of that is limited to what population needs. So there is indeed there will be a huge fight for space to actually produce caloric products, that could feed the population in a city. And then you were with me in Lely visiting the company and how they have these technologies for, in principle, empowering farmers to even detach themselves from the larger systems of pasteurizing milk or bottled milk. But these are very niche technologies. They are very expensive. A farmer cannot invest in having a small farm in the city in which they can do the whole process. Mostly as well because of the whole political situation. There is no horizon, and does it make sense to invest in this technology that I will need to amortize for 40 years if next month the government decides that we don't have dairy more in the country. So there's a lot of very complicated questions here that doesn't make. I mean, maybe in other contexts could work, but in this country, which is so small and so much competition for space, that is very hard to imagine this kind of shared space between food production and urbanization.
Thank you very much. I think we're over time a bit, so thanks.